My name is Alison Southall from Fernal Heath Baptist Church, Worcestershire in the UK, one of the mission partners with Emmanuel Cathedral, Arua, northern Uganda. I first gave this presentation at Emmanuel Cathedral on the 22nd of June 2018 as part of the Madi and West Nile Diocese Centenary celebrations. This presentation talks about the Gardner family, who were the first missionaries to arrive in Arua. I first heard about the Gardners in 2014 when I visited this memorial stone near Arua. As the Diocese is celebrating its centenary in 2018, I thought it would be good to bring a greeting from the Gardners' descendants, so I started to search for the Gardner family online. God was good and I managed to contact several of their grandchildren and also great-grandchildren, and they send greetings to their brothers and sisters in Madi and West Nile Diocese. They were surprised to hear about the centenary and that Frank, Edith and Alfred were still remembered for their role as church planters 100 years ago. I showed them pictures of the consecration of the new bishop from 2017 to show how much the church has grown over 100 years, and they were very pleasantly surprised. I was also able to visit one granddaughter, Rosemary, who was kind enough to share a lot of information and stories about her grandparents, and also passed on copies of her grandmother's diary, some of her grandfather's letters, and some photographs. The Gardners were ordinary people, but with God-given gifts and a heart to spread the gospel. They were Baptists like myself. Frank was the son of a postman and had worked on the railway since he was 16. His brother, Alfred, worked as an office boy. Edith was the daughter of a butcher and then became a shop assistant in a furniture shop. They were not formally trained, but loved reading and learning languages, and they learnt much from other missionaries. Frank was also a talented artist and engineer. Having heard the call, Frank left his job to better himself by serving God overseas. In 1905 he set out to serve God in Nyasaland, which is now Malawi. His younger brother Alfred, born in 1887, followed his brother to Nyasaland in 1911 and worked alongside Frank until 1919. In 1909, Frank returned to England and to Chipping Norton Baptist Church. Here he met a young shop assistant called Edith Seaton. She was a Sunday school teacher at Chipping Norton Baptist Church, and her family ran a butcher's shop in another part of the country, Southall in Northamptonshire. When she was 10 years old, she told a Christian lady in her village that when she got older, she intended to go far away over the sea as a missionary. She had decided to move away from Southall to find her own employment, and God led her to Chipping Norton, the home of Frank. They became friends during Frank's time back in England, and she writes this in her diary. One day I received a letter from him asking if the friendship could be developed, etc., so that evening we met and had our first walk together. We had much in common, and although I had never thought of going overseas myself, although very interested in the work, I had prayed that I might become a real worker for God. When that letter came, I spread it before the Lord, and a voice seemed to say to me, "This is my choice for you." They became engaged, but the missionary board thought that she was too young, and she had to wait 2 years until she sailed out to Africa to join Frank. In her diary she writes this. When I had arrived at Chindi, I had received a letter from Frank saying that our wedding was fixed for November the 18th, the Saturday after my arrival in Ngoniland. A conference for African and Europeans was to commence on Sunday the 19th, and as a number of folks were coming in for that, the wedding had been planned for the day before. How I did wish that we could have decided on the date after my arrival. But in those days personal feelings had to take a very back place. We arrived on that Thursday evening, November the 16th, 1911, and were married on the 18th. Their first child, Edith, was born in 1912. These were happy and productive years. However, in 1915, they returned to England, intending to come back to Nyasaland a few months later. The journey included travelling by land, train and 4 boats. The timing was not good for Edith as she was pregnant, and sadly, as soon as she reached Chipping Norton, unwell with malaria, she gave birth to a premature baby, Grace, who died after half an hour. During this time, Frank's father also died, and Edith's brother was injured in the war in France. Another of Edith's brothers died in the war later in 1918. Although they had intended to return to Nyasaland, they were informed that there was not enough money, and so God began to lead them in new directions. Instead, they made plans to go to the Belgian Congo with C.T. Studd's Heart of Africa mission. A group of 9 were planning to sail out together. Edith's diary explains, "We had farewell meetings in London in July, great meetings, C.T. being so well known, at Central Hall, Westminster, Aldersgate Street and West Norwood. Great posters were up reading, 'All day prayer and praise, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Central Hall, Westminster. Inauguration of Christ's Crusade by farewelling of Mr. C.T. Studd and party for the Heart of Africa. Your prayers are earnestly invited for the outgoing party, leaving Paddington on Monday the 24th at 9:40 p.m. Confetti would be out of place, but a shower bath of hallelujahs is always in season.'" However, you can see that their names are crossed out on this passenger list. Edith explains why. "In the morning at Falmouth came a great disappointment. At the customs office, we 3 Gardners were told that our passports were not in order. Another ruling had been passed since ours had been used. Very, very special precautions were everywhere. We had had to send a list of all clothing, etc., which we were taking out. The passports of Frank and Alf were out of order. This meant that they had to go before the military tribunal again. As they were missionaries on furlough, they had passed easily before. Well, this was a blow. The rest of the party went out to the boats to the ship via a launch. We had to decide quickly which trunk we needed, as all our luggage had already been put on board. We knew we would have another month at home. C.T. wired Mrs. Studd. We 3 got back to the station and to London. Frank and I back to Finchley Road. Keswick Convention was on just at that time. Mrs. Studd was there, and she sent a note to the Keswick platform asking for definite prayer for the 3 recruits who had been kept back from sailing. God answered prayer. The 2 men were soon passed by their tribunals. You can see from this passenger list that they were able to sail a month later. However, it was 1916, and therefore the middle of the First World War. Travelling by sea was extremely dangerous, with German U-boats targeting British ships. They therefore had to make the difficult decision to leave behind their 3-year-old daughter Edith to stay with friends, not knowing that they would not see her for 7 years. Edith writes this: "I was very keen that Edith should have a companion. We had several offers, but this one with the Brett family seemed the most suitable. Missionaries have had to leave their children through all the years, but only those who go through it can understand. We appreciated Mrs. Brett's kind offer and knew that Edith would be well cared for. When arranging for all this, we attended a convention at Birmingham for a couple of days. One speaker spoke on 1 Samuel 6, verse 10 and 12, separation for the king's business. He gave an illustration of one missionary mother leaving her child, who had said, 'A lump came into my throat as I left my child, which increased during the journey until I thought it would choke me. In desperation in my cabin one day, I cast my burden upon the Lord, and he gave me peace.' I knew then God was speaking to me. Edith was 3.5 years old. She would soon forget us, a heartbreaking thought, but best for her, and he would carry us through a day at a time." So they arrived in the Belgian Congo in 1916. And this map shows the journey that they made over the next 7 years from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of Africa. They served in the Belgian Congo for 2 years. However, a number of missionaries had a disagreement with C.T. Studd's style of leadership, which led to the 3 Gardners transferring to Africa Inland Mission. The Gardners and C.T. Studd disagreed about the policy to use interpreters rather than learning the tribal languages. The Gardners felt that it was important to learn the people's first language and to teach and disciple new Christians. During this time, their daughter Beryl was born, and when she was a month old, January 1918, they began their journey from Nyangara via Dungu and Moldisa to Yangarakata in Congo. They travelled on foot with Edith and baby Beryl being carried in a hammock. The 3 Gardners joined other AIM missionaries in Yangarakata in Congo for a conference. This map shows very roughly the journey that the Gardners took from Nyangara, where they were working for Heart of Africa Mission, to the border with Uganda, where they began their work with Africa Inland Mission. The journey was over 300 miles, which took 21 days of travelling over a 5-month period, with baby Beryl just a few months old. Edith continues with the story. It had been decided that we should open the work in the West Nile district of Uganda, as the government were asking for Protestant workers. There was no Christian work there at all. The government official had only been living there 2 years. The CMS had been approached, but said they had no men and no money, so asked the Africa Inland Mission to take it on. It meant starting from scratch, as the language had not been reduced to writing. We had to wait for the red tape and all the formalities to be settled. This had happened because a short while before, God had led another group of missionaries to the West Nile region of Uganda. They were planning to pass through the area, but one missionary fell ill. While they waited, the district commissioner, Mr. Weatherhead, asked them to stay and help with famine relief efforts. It was decided that the Gardners were the right people to start this work in Arua. Frank and Alf went ahead of Edith and Beryl to make preparations. Edith writes in her diary, "We had read the 91st Psalm and had prayed together before he left for Vura camp and the commencement of the work at Arua." Psalm 91 talks about putting trust in God and talks about God protecting his people from pestilence, from disease, from all sorts of dangers, which in fact is what happened. Edith continues in her diary, "Whenever Frank could get hold of a runner, he would send me a letter telling of living in the tent and then in the round hut, and of the difficulty of getting men to work. They had never worked for a white man before or had any contact with them. But one afternoon, just as I was going out with Beryl, a cyclist appeared on the road. It was Frank. What a joy! After more than 5 weeks of being on my own, and with so many bad nights with Beryl, it was to have someone to share things. God had answered prayer in so many ways, and we were so very thankful. To cross over from Congo to Uganda, one just crosses over a huge ditch, but at once one noticed the difference. Better villages, better road tracks and healthier people. Having lived near to the Portuguese border and then in Congo, one realised that things were much better under British rule. On June the 1st, we arrived at Vura camp. How thankful we were. This large camp of good-sized African huts had been loaned to the American contingent of AIM while decisions were made re new stations. Everything in the camp was in excellent condition. There was one large open square pavilion for meals. We were given a double hut with a passage between. The site for our station was 10 miles further on. Frank cycled there each morning early and back again by sunset. He was trying to get up a 3-roomed mud house and have it dry for Beryl and me. On June the 10th, at long last, we were able to go to Arua to live. I had not been there at all, so everything was new. Beryl was just 6 months old to the day. We were still carrying her around. The West Nile district, Arua, was a very different countryside from other places we had lived in. It was 2 or 3 miles beyond the British government post. The concession was being cleared. We lived partly in the tent and partly in the 3-room mud house, which was gradually drying off. No windows or doors or shutters. We had native mats to roll up and down. The walls did not come up to the roof. There was a wide space in between, so the air blew around us. There was not a nail in the building. It had taken a tremendous lot of work to build it. The people were not prepared for regular or hard work. Frank and his brother had much of the work to do themselves, even to the digging of the big holes for the poles. These days were a great strain on Frank particularly. Irregular workers and not enough. The job of trying to get men to go to the forest to cut trees for the roof supports. Wet days when no one would work, with very little food to buy. Both men went down with malaria. We learnt too what the digging of the wells meant, and several places were tried before we got decent water. The country was almost park-like, grass with big trees. We were 40 miles from the Nile, which we could see shining in the sun on clear days. Tiny villages were all around us. The Lugbara men wore no clothing at all, and the women wore a bob of grass back and front. They were a clean people, and interested in the first white people to live among them. They continually passed our hut on the way to their gardens, and watched all our ways. The chief would very often put his head through the window space and greet me, and see what I was doing. Edith also said, "Pioneer work is not easy. To get up a good house with few workers, little money, the language not reduced to writing, no gardens and very little food to buy, is a real job of work. We had comparative youth on our side. I was 30 and Frank was 37.5, but our health was not good. One often wonders how one got through those days." Edith employed 2 boys to help her around the house, perhaps the 2 boys pictured here with Beryl. She writes, "I managed to get 2 little boys to come to my aid. It was amusing to see them attack my washing. They would sit on either side of the canvas bath full of water and certainly do their best. These little boys had never seen a mirror before. When these lads looked into it, they were amazed and had quite a job to make themselves realise they were looking at themselves. Twice the boys tried to cheat me. I counted the coins twice, 99. I turned the boy round, and there on a very thin thread of bark at the back of his knee was the missing cent. The second time I noticed that the boy had something in his mouth. It was a cent. They did not try again." Frank, in his letters back home, writes about language learning. "Edie stays there in Bura over the Sunday, and I also have to go to Mr. Mount's station at Arua in Belgian Congo for the Sunday for a talk on the language, as Mr. Mount is at present the authority in Lugbara. I'm hoping for a great deal from this. We have already got a great many words from him." And Edith writes, "We had practically no time for language and trying to get words. It was a race against time to get a certain amount done before the rains came on. Of course we had a pencil and paper with us getting sounds, but it was the house building which was the first concern. Then huts had to be put up for schoolwork was to be a big factor at Arua. And what a tremendous work it has become too." Mr. Alison was one of the missionaries in the Congo in Yangarakata, and he writes about the language, the Lugbara language. "Their language is quite a poser so far. What you think you have learned, you find you have to unlearn later on. For instance, we have over a week been trying to find out the word for help, and cannot get it. Please pray that this exceedingly difficult language may soon be conquered enough to give them the gospel." It took quite a few more years before this was the case. In the short time that the Gardners were in Arua, they were able to start a Sunday service with a small group from 5 different tribes. Frank had to use 3 different languages, but had very little Lugbara at this point. Frank in August 19 writes, "Last Sunday we had our usual Swahili service, and the numbers keep up nicely. I have now procured some Lunguro hymn books from the CMS missionary at Masindi, so the singing goes better. One of the members, Madi, who knows Ganji, Lunguro, Luganda and Swahili, recently bought Edie a present of nicely decorated gourds and some skins, leopard, monkey and the skin of a smaller animal, and a nice drum to call the people to the services." Edith also writes about the services. She says, "A few Lugbara used to creep into the tent too. They gradually got used to us living in their midst." Edith also writes about famine, which was endemic at the time. "We went through a time of famine at Arua. The rains did not come. Famine. What horrors the word brings. The people lived on leaves and grass. Many died. The government sent us bags of beans, which came down the Nile, and we had to distribute it to the people, a handful per person per day. The folk were so hungry that many of them devoured these dry beans straight away and suffered terribly. They would just lie down, their stomachs distended and groan in pain. We ourselves had very little to eat, a few sweet potatoes and rice boiled in water with a little salt. At one time we were living on rice 3 times a day and 1 cup of tea daily." And here is a wonderful painting that Frank made of the house that he was building for his family in Mvara. We believe that it was located very close to where the diocesan secretary's house is, not far from the new cathedral. It seems that having started to sow the seed that the work in West Nile would falter, when in November 1918 Frank had his second bout of blackwater fever. He recovered, but while still recuperating, both Frank and Edith succumbed to Spanish flu. When they'd recovered from this, they went to Arua to rest. But there Alfred became ill, and then Frank had a third attack of blackwater fever and very nearly died. Edith held on to this promise from Isaiah 26 verse 3. "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." A fellow missionary, John Byes, asked Edith Gardner, "Now what are you getting out of life, with a sick husband, a sick child," because Beryl was very often off colour, "living in this shack with hardly any food around?" Edith said, "Well, things look dark now, but the sun will shine again. We are here because there is work to be done." However, in the end, it did become necessary for them to move to a healthier climate, to Kenya, and after less than a year, before they had even completed their house, they left Arua. Edith wrote that Frank wept as he thought of all he had hoped to do at Arua. The Sundays in Africa, what memories they stir up! Church services, tent services, walking to village meetings, fevers, and often an hour or so of quiet reading. Sunshine and shadows, this is life all through. Those wonderful dawns, to the gradual light revealing the villages, the sleepy folk coming to the entrance of the villages saying, "Mzungu, kapita olendo." The wonderful sunsets, the fading light and darkness, quickly falling like a curtain on the land. These are all never to be forgotten pictures. Nor can one forget the most wonderful scent of the earth after the first heavy shower, after the long dry season. We would go outside and just sniff and glory in the freshness of everything. However, others were interested in continuing the work, so the seeds that had been planted would continue to be watered. They travelled by land to Mutir, down Lake Albert by the Samuel Baker, by land to Masindi, across Lake Yoga on the boat the Stanley, by train to Jinja, and by boat across Lake Victoria on the Clement Hill to Kisumu, and finally by train to Kijabe, Kenya. This journey was over 600 miles. They were later stationed at Kinyona in Kenya. The climate there suited Frank much better. He was involved in evangelism and Edith was engaged in medical work. During their time here, 1919 to 1923, their son Rex was born in 1920. Edith writes some wonderful stories about the two children, Beryl and Rex, in Kenya. Frank made 2 little grass huts for Beryl and Rex at Kinyona, and they would sit on a stool at their doorways with hands on their knees in true Kikuyu fashion, and chatter and call out to the Akikuyas as they came back from their gardens. They had perfect idiom and often corrected their father, who really was a good speaker. One time we were waiting for porters. The children kept calling out to the passing Kikuyu, had they seen them? At last Rex said, "Mama, God knows where the porters are. We had better pray and ask him to hurry them up." Down on his knees he went, and they told God all about it in a mixture of English and Kikuyu. After nearly 7 years in Africa, they planned their return home. They knew that once they returned to the UK, they would probably not be sent back because of Frank's previous illnesses. So Frank made preparations for ministry in the UK, including learning Greek. Their journey included travelling by foot and train to the port at Mombasa and taking the north route around the continent of Africa via the Mediterranean, including Genoa, Marseille and Gibraltar. The two children enjoyed the journey as they'd never seen the sea before. On arrival, they were reunited with Edith, now 11 years old, and the rest of the family, although Edith's father had recently passed away. As expected, AIM would not send them out again. When they first returned to England, it was hard to adjust to life in the UK. They did not have their own home and had to live with family where there was a lack of space and they were very short of money. Edith writes, "After the wide spaces of Africa, life was not easy, nor living with other folk, kind as they were. We were able to get Beryl into a nearby school. How she shrank from this after her isolated life as far as whites were concerned." After a few months, Frank was called to be the minister at the railway mission in Carlisle, where they stayed for 5.5 years. After this, Frank was a minister for 25 years in Glasgow, Scotland. Having heard the Gardner's story, I would like to reflect on this question: was it worth the cost? During their time in Africa, they suffered many illnesses, including malaria, blackwater fever, Spanish flu, many other problems as well. There was a cost to their family, including the loss of baby Grace and separation from Edith. And at times it was very lonely for Edith, sometimes being the only white woman for miles and miles around. However, as well as the costs, there is an important legacy that they've left behind. If you look at the graph on this slide, you will see that the time in Uganda is very small in comparison with the time that was spent in other countries, including the UK. However, in those few months that they were in Arua, they were able to plant the seeds and build the foundations which were to become the church of Madi and West Nile Diocese that we know today, that is growing and thriving and is still continuing to plant new churches. I would like to close this presentation with the words of one of the Gardners' great-grandchildren, Adrian Beavis, who is the vicar of St Luke's Church, Earl's Court in London. When he heard about the celebrations that were going on for the Centenary, when he saw how the church was thriving today, these were his words reflecting on the work of his great-grandparents. I hope this encourages us never to think fruitfulness and faithfulness are judged by size, that even in pain and seeming failure, God is still at work. No matter how small the seeds we think we are sowing today, God is the Lord of the harvest and can bring forth a fruit 100-fold. So don't despise the day of small beginnings and keep sowing. Amen.